Our UI is good to go, but the app still uses fake data, so our next task is to get real data in there. Before we can actually make any networking calls, however, we need to make it easy to construct URLs. In the past, we've only worked with simple URLs, so we didn't have to give this much thought. But as you saw earlier, the iTunes Search API has several options for fine-tuning a search. In the Models group, let's add a new group in here called Endpoint. We're going to add a few files in here to model the different aspects of the endpoint. So how are we going to model this? Well, we don't want to have anything to do with strings when creating our URLs. So we're going to make use of some small types. When we created the first search request, there were a few different parameters we passed in as key value pairs. So let's start there by modeling those parameters as types. Create a new Swift file inside the endpoint group and call it iTunes Media. Aside from the term, the first parameter we specified was to describe the type of media we want to search for. If you go back to the API docs and look at the value for the key media, you'll see that there's a set number of items. So we can modify this as an enum. From the code snippets link below in the teacher's notes, grab the code for the iTunes Media enum and paste it in. Here, we've defined an enum that encapsulates all possible values we can specify as a value for the media key. In addition, we've provided an implementation for the description property by conforming to custom string convertible. This means that to actually list the value in our parameter pair, we don't have to type out the string. We can simply call the description property on any of these enum values. So now, how do we actually use this? We need to go from here to ultimately a request object containing a valid URL. Let's add another file to the endpoint group. So new file, Swift file, and we're going to name this endpoint. In here, let's define an enum called iTunes. Now, I don't know about you, but this is always jarring to me because the real iTunes is lowercase I, uppercase T, but we're going to stick with type naming conventions here. This enum is going to serve as our interface for working with the API. When we want to get a certain URL, we'll pick an enum member and provide certain arguments to help narrow things down. Each enum member corresponds to a different endpoint in the Search API. The first endpoint we looked at was the search endpoint, so let's add that in as an enum member. So we'll say case search. This isn't enough information, right? I can't just say I want to perform a request against the search endpoint without providing some information. At minimum, I need a search term because that is a required parameter. So how do we provide arguments to enum members? Through the use of associated values. So let's modify this enum member to take a term as a string and a media type as a value of iTunes Media. Remember that media is not a required parameter in the API, so we're allowing the user to bypass providing the value here by making it an optional. Now, when we want to create a URL, we can simply say iTunes.search and provide a term and an optional media type and allow the enum to do the work and create the URL. Before we get to that though, let's take a second to talk about the structure of a URL in the next video.